She couldn't scream, not through the gag they'd stuffed between her teeth, and even if she could, no one would have come. Laughter rang in the distance. Her wrists bled, but dawn was coming, and so was he. The ropes had cut into her arms hours ago. Her dress, soaked through with dew and dust, hung crooked across her shoulders, and every twitch of her ankle sent a fresh wave of fire through her calves where the wheel's wooden spokes pressed deep into her skin. Clara Dane didn't cry anymore. She'd stopped after the first hour, not because the pain dulled, it hadn't, but because something deeper had settled in her chest, something heavier than shame and colder than fear. It wasn't the first time they'd mocked her, not by far, but it was the first time they'd laid hands on her. And when they dragged her from the churchyard in the dark, laughing, daring each other louder with every step, she thought maybe it was just to humiliate her like always. Maybe a prank, another cruel joke before they all stumbled back to their daddy's houses drunk on power and whiskey. But when they tied her to the wheel, stripped off her bonnet, shoved a rag into her mouth, and left her there in the dust outside the mill, she knew. They weren't just laughing anymore. They were leaving her. Like livestock. Like a warning. Like a thing. And no one, not the housemaids who lit lamps in the morning, not the market men setting up stalls, not even the deputies who'd passed by in silence, had come near her. They saw. And they turned away. She was too big, they said, too loud, too plain, too bold, a judge's daughter who didn't know her place, and worse, who dared to speak when others were quiet. And that, more than her weight, more than her size, was the reason they wanted her broken. The sun crept higher now, warm and slow, stretching gold across the dry road like it didn't notice the trembling girl bound to the wagon wheel, the spit-soaked gag, the dried blood around her fingernails. Chickens stirred near the livery stable. Hooves clicked over stones. Somewhere a bell rang once. Then twice. And then she heard him. The cart didn't look like much. A boxy rig, patched along the joints with rope and bent nails, creaked toward the square with a familiar limp. One wheel always caught on itself, making the whole thing rattle slightly to the left. The man driving it sat with his hat low and his shoulders hunched, the kind of tired posture that told of too many miles and not enough sleep. A boy, maybe 5 or 6, leaned against his side, fast asleep with a crust of jam on his cheek. 2 girls sat in the back, hugging their knees, quiet and watching. Jonas Vance. Widowed 3 winters ago, carpenter by trade. His wife died birthing the youngest, the boy Caleb, and since then he'd kept mostly to himself. Folks said he was kind but distant, honest but quiet, and worn thin by grief that refused to fade. He didn't stop at first. Didn't even glance her way. But then the smallest girl in the back, a pale little thing with dark curls and a face too serious for her years, tapped her father's arm. "Papa," she said, "she's crying." He pulled the reins. Hard. The cart groaned and halted. Jonas stood slowly, one boot hitting the dirt with a thud. He saw her then, all of her, the bruises, the gag, the wheel, the blood. And he froze. Not from fear, but from rage. Behind his eyes something moved, slow and heavy, like the cracking of ice under pressure. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look around. He just walked to her and cut the ropes. She fell forward into his arms, limp as a rag doll, eyes wide and wild. He didn't flinch. He held her like she weighed nothing. Like she wasn't a burden. Like she was something precious. Someone gasped from a window above. Boots scuffed against stone. Voices murmured. But Jonas didn't care. He lifted her, turned, and carried her to the cart. The boy stirred but didn't wake. The girls made space. Clara didn't protest, didn't resist. She collapsed against the rough wood and let the tears come then, hot and silent. He didn't ask. He didn't scold. He just drove. Out of the square. Out of the town that had watched and said nothing. And into the hills. where no one followed. She woke to the sound of chickens. The air smelled like pine and bread dough. The pain was still there, deep and pulsing, but muted now, softened by warm blankets and the strange comfort of a window view that didn't include ridicule. Clara shifted slightly and winced. Her hands were bandaged, her arms bruised, but she was alive. And safe. Jonas sat at the edge of the room, shirt sleeves rolled up, sharpening a blade in slow, practiced motions. When he noticed her stir, he stopped. "You hungry?" he asked. His voice was rough but not unkind. She tried to speak. Nothing came. He poured water into a cup and held it out. She drank slowly. "Where am I?" she rasped. "My land, few miles from town." She blinked. "Why'd you help me?" He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Because no one else did." Clara stared at him. No one had ever said that before, not like it mattered. Outside the girls giggled, chickens clucked, a dog barked once. And Clara deigned, shamed, mocked, tossed aside like refuse, closed her eyes and wept into her palms. Not from pain, but because someone had seen her, and not turned away. The first full day at Jonas Vance's homestead passed not like a storm or a fever dream, but like thaw, slow, quiet, heavy. Clara barely moved from the cot tucked in the corner of the cabin. Her body, though mending, still carried the stiffness of humiliation, her limbs aching in ways deeper than bruises. She'd been offered shelter before, brief gestures of pity, dry porches during hard rain, but never sanctuary. Never a room left undisturbed for her, food set aside without comment, kindness that asked nothing in return. Jonas didn't speak much that first day. After tending the livestock and splitting wood until the sun slouched low behind the ridge, he returned with a bowl of stew, plain but warm, and set it on a little table beside her. Then he left again, not out of coldness, but out of some quiet knowing that too much attention might do more harm than good. Clara watched his silhouette vanish into the fading light, then turned to the stew. She ate in slow, careful spoonfuls, feeling something shift inside her with every bite. Hunger, yes, but also something older. Something she hadn't felt since before her mother passed. Safety. The girls peeked in just once. The older one, Caroline, she'd learned, offered her a rag doll stitched with crooked arms and mismatched buttons for eyes. Clara stared at it, unsure what to do. But then the girl whispered, "You looked sad," and left the doll on the windowsill before disappearing again. The other child, Miriam, had big eyes and a watchful way about her, as if the world had already taught her to expect sudden change. Neither stared, neither laughed, and neither mentioned the wagon wheel. By morning, Clara rose slowly and dressed herself, wincing with each movement. Her old clothes had been scrubbed and folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She slipped them on and tied her boots with shaking fingers. When she stepped outside, the sunlight startled her. It touched her face like something holy. The yard stretched wide and plain, chickens scratching, a mule tethered to a post, rows of split logs stacked high against the side of the house. Jonas knelt by the trough, patching a leak in the corner with a bit of leather cord and melted wax. She cleared her throat softly. He didn't look up. "Feel strong enough to walk?" he asked. She nodded. "Good, coop needs cleaning." He didn't wait for thanks or excuse. He simply stood and walked back toward the shed, trusting that she'd follow. And she did. Not because she felt she owed him anything, but because there was something in his tone, in the simplicity of the ask, that felt human. The work was hard and messy and honest. Her hands blistered by midday, her arms sore from hauling buckets and scrubbing wood. But Jonas worked beside her, never once commenting on her pace, her size, her silences. He just worked. And when the chores were done and the sun began its long red crawl behind the tree line, he handed her a cup of well water and said, "Rest, you've earned it." That night Clara sat by the hearth while the children played. Jonas whittled quietly in the corner, shaping a bit of cedar into something bird-like. The boy, Caleb, climbed into her lap uninvited and fell asleep without hesitation. His tiny hand curled against her arm like it belonged there, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the need to move. It became a rhythm after that. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Not a schedule, not a punishment, a rhythm, a life. On the 5th day, she stood at the edge of the clearing with Jonas beside her, their shoulders not quite touching, and asked the question that had begun clawing at her chest. Do they know I'm here? He didn't pretend not to understand. He just squinted toward the tree line. Most likely. And they haven't come. No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because they're cowards, and because your father's name keeps M second-guessing. Clara flinched. He won't come for me. I know. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the pine. She looked at him. You sure? Jonas finally turned toward her, eyes heavy and steady. You were tied to a wheel like a pig before slaughter, in the open, under his jurisdiction. If he was coming, he'd have come. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just nodded. And then she whispered, I hate him. Jonas didn't respond, not directly. He only said, hate's a heavy thing. Carry it too long and it starts chewing on your spine. She looked back toward the house, where Caroline was hanging rags on a line, and Miriam sat brushing her doll's yarn hair with a pine twig. And what do you carry? She asked. He took a long breath. Loss. That night Clara found herself at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed. The fire burned low. Jonas sat across from her, his cup half full, his fingers idly rolling a small stone between knuckles. I wasn't always this way, she said softly. He looked up. Which way? Biggs loud, angry. He didn't answer. She continued. When my mama was alive, I used to read poetry, paint, sing. But when she died, my father said I needed to toughen up, that a judge's daughter couldn't waste time on useless things. Jonas nodded slowly. Clara stared into the fire. So I toughened up, I shouted back. I grew thicker, louder, meaner, and now folks only see the shell. I see more, Jonas said. She looked at him. His face was unreadable, not kind, not cruel, just true. I see a woman who's been tested, still standing, still strong. Clara swallowed. I don't feel strong. Strength ain't a feeling. It's what you do when the feelings try to bury you. They sat in silence for a long time after that. Eventually Clara stood. She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. Why did you really stop that day? She asked without turning. Jonas leaned back, sighing through his nose. Because Caroline saw you first, but I would have seen you soon enough. Clara looked back. And if she hadn't? He shrugged. I'd still have stopped. Doesn't matter who you are or what they say. You don't leave someone to bleed where they were thrown. She nodded. Then she whispered, good night. Night. 3 days later, the first threat arrived. A letter. No name. Just a folded note nailed to the barn door. Return what ain't yours, or we'll come take it. Jonas read it in silence. Then he burned it. Clara watched the ash rise. And something in her eyes hardened. She didn't want protection. She wanted justice. The second letter came 2 nights later, tucked under the edge of the chicken coop door, written in the same jagged hand and smeared with something dark that might have been tobacco or blood. This one didn't threaten, it promised. Next time we won't write. Jonas read it under the pale flicker of the oil lamp while Clara stood beside him, arms crossed against her chest. Her face didn't flinch, not even a twitch, but the tightness in her jaw told him enough. She'd been waiting for this, maybe even expecting it. She didn't ask what he was going to do. She already knew. Jonas folded the letter in half and stuffed it into the iron stove without a word. The flames swallowed it hungrily. Then he rose, checked the lock on the front door, and walked to the window. It was quiet out there, still. Too still. A town like theirs didn't stay quiet after a scandal, especially not one involving a judge's daughter and a carpenter known for keeping to himself. Jonas didn't care much for town opinion, but he wasn't blind to it either. Folks whispered when he passed now. The men looked away. The women looked longer, some out of pity, others out of disgust. And Clara, she didn't walk into town at all. Not anymore. Not since the wheel. Jonas hadn't asked what exactly happened that night, who tied her, who stood by, but he could see the aftermath plain as day. She flinched when boots scuffed too loud on wood. She sat with her back to walls, and she avoided mirrors like they were bear traps. That was a different kind of wound, one no stitches could fix. That night Jonas laid his shotgun across the window sill and sat in the rocking chair by the door. He didn't say it out loud, but Clara knew what he meant. He wouldn't let them take her. Not without a fight. By the end of the week, the whispers turned to names. The boys who'd done it, Reese Hardwick, Travis Boone, and Mason Caldwell, had grown louder in town, not quieter, drunk on pride and the protection their fathers gave them. They tossed dice behind the saloon, slapped coins on tables too hard, and spoke Clara's name like it was a dirty joke passed between teeth stained yellow from liquor. And no one stopped them. Not the judge. Not the preacher. Not the sheriff. Because in towns like these, shame didn't fall on the ones who did the hurting. It fell on the ones who got hurt. Jonas knew the pattern well, had seen it after his wife passed when people stopped calling, stopped inviting, stopped helping. Widowers made folks uncomfortable, especially the kind with kids still in need of feeding and questions still in need of answers. He'd grown used to silence, learned to thrive in it. But Clara wasn't born for silence. That Sunday, she put on the same faded blue dress she'd worn the week before, torn, mended, now clean, and walked into church like she still belonged there. She didn't look left, didn't look right, just walked straight to the third row, chin high, and sat down beside Jonas and the children. The preacher stuttered through his opening prayer. Reese Hardwick laughed loud enough for all to hear. No one said a word. After the service, Clara didn't rush out. She stood beneath the whitewashed awning, her eyes scanning the crowd as they spilled from the chapel in polite clusters. Some nodded to her, others didn't. The judge stood on the steps, stiff in his coat, hands behind his back. He didn't approach. But his eyes never left her. Jonas stepped beside her. "We can go." She shook her head. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because they need to see I'm not afraid." He didn't press, he just waited. And when the judge turned finally and walked away, his boots clicking sharp on stone, Clara smiled. Just a little. They came that night. 3 of them. On foot. No torches. No horses. Just knives and rope. Jonas heard the brush snap first, a single pop like dry wood cracking under weight, then a hush, then another. He didn't wake Clara, didn't call for the kids. He just slipped on his boots, grabbed the shotgun from the window, and stepped onto the porch. They stopped halfway to the steps when they saw him. "Even in?" said Travis Boone, voice slick like grease. "You're on my land," Jonas said calm. "We're just here for what's ours," Mason muttered, his blade glinting faint in the moonlight. "Ain't nothing here belongs to you." "She does," Reese sneered. "Judge's orders." Jonas took one step forward. "You come another foot closer, and I'll scatter your teeth across this yard." That made them pause. Reese spit into the grass. "You think she'll stay, a girl like that, with a man like you?" Jonas didn't answer. Instead, he raised the shotgun. One click, one breath. And they backed off. Not fast, but far enough. You're gonna regret this, Travis hissed. Whole town'll turn on you. Let 'em, Jonas said. And they left. But not before Reese turned one last time and smiled. Not the smile of someone beaten. The smile of someone planning. Inside, Clara stood just behind the door, fists white at her sides. I should leave, she whispered. No. I'm bringing danger to your children. They're already in danger, every time they see a world that lets men like that walk free. She stepped toward him. I'm not your responsibility. He looked down at her. You tied to that wheel wasn't my responsibility either, but I saw it, and now I can't unsee it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I don't want pity. This ain't pity. Then what is it? He stepped closer, his voice dropped to a whisper. It's fire. She blinked. What? I've been cold a long time, Clara, and you make the air warm again. She didn't kiss him. Didn't need to. She just stepped closer, leaned her forehead to his chest and breathed. And for the first time in years, Jonas let his hand rise and rest gently on someone else's shoulder. Not because they needed saving, but because they needed each other. By the time morning came, word of the confrontation had already spread. The judge summoned Jonas to town, not by letter but by deputy. Jonas didn't flinch. He hitched the wagon, kissed the children, and told Clara he'd be back by sundown. But she wasn't so sure. Men like the judge didn't summon. They declared. And when Jonas rode off, she stared after him until the dust settled. She didn't eat. Didn't speak. Just waited. And prayed. The town of Crowsneck was quieter than usual when Jonas rode in. It wasn't Sunday and it wasn't market day, yet folks stood still on porches and sidewalks like they'd been waiting for him. Eyes followed him, narrowed, guarded. A few whispered his name. Others didn't bother to whisper at all. Jonas kept his gaze forward as the wagon rolled down the main street. The sheriff watched from his stoop, arms folded, the star on his chest dulled from years without polish. He didn't tip his hat, didn't nod, just watched. Jonas passed him like he would a fence post. The judge's house was perched like a wound at the end of town, white-walled with thick red shutters and steps too clean for a man with dirt on his hands. Jonas pulled up and dismounted without tying the reins. Either he'd be leaving soon or not at all. A butler opened the door, didn't speak, just gestured him through the front parlor and into the study, where the judge sat behind a wide desk carved from black walnut. His robe hung behind him like a warning. His eyes, pale and hard, lifted only once. Sit, he said, not looking up again. Jonas didn't. You had men on my land, he said flatly. I heard, the judge replied, finally raising his chin. I also heard they left unharmed. Weren't for lack of reason. The judge studied him a long time. He poured a glass of whiskey, drank half, then set it down without offering a second. You've made a spectacle of yourself. You mean I didn't let your boys string a woman like an animal for laughs? The judge didn't react. You brought my daughter's name into disrepute, he said instead. Jonas took a slow step forward. No, sir, you did that, when you let them treat her like she was less than dirt. That girl is unmarried, unwanted, and ungrateful, the judge snapped. She has no understanding of what her position demands, of what I demand. You demand silence, Jonas said, obedience, shame, and you call it law. The judge leaned forward now, voice low and tight. I'm giving you one chance, Vance, return her, and I'll make sure your children stay fed. You'll find work. Your name won't rot in the mouths of the town. And if I do? The judge smiled, a tight stretch of lips with no joy behind it. Then you're not a father anymore. You're a man marked, And you know what this town does to marked men." Jonah stared at him, unmoved. "I'll take the mark," he said, "better than wearing your stain." The judge's fist clenched, but he didn't rise. Jonas turned without another word. Outside, the air smelled like sweat and heat and something old gone sour. The wagon still stood where he'd left it. No harm, no sabotage, which meant the judge wanted time. Time to twist the town tighter, to whisper in the ears of old allies, to make Jonas a problem to solve instead of a man to understand. He climbed into the wagon seat, flicked the reins once, and rode back without looking behind him. Back home, Clara had waited on the porch since mid-morning. The children brought her food, but she didn't eat. Just rocked in the chair Jonas built when his youngest was born, each creak of the wood a heartbeat she couldn't control. When the wagon finally rolled into view, her chest cracked with something too large to name. She didn't run down the path, didn't shout, she just stood. When Jonas dismounted, her knees nearly gave out. He took the steps 2 at a time, and for the first time since she'd come, he held her without asking. Without permission. Without fear. And she let him. They didn't speak of the meeting that night, not directly. But when Jonas checked the locks for the 3rd time, when he laid the rifle across the table instead of the rack, she understood. It was coming. Not tonight maybe, but soon. The town would not let her go quietly, nor would the judge. And so they prepared. Jonas sharpened tools. Clara stocked firewood. They taught the children how to listen for sounds in the woods that didn't belong, how to climb out the window quietly, where to hide, how to whistle 3 times before running back. It was not the life they wanted, but it was the life they had. On the 3rd night after Jonas's return, Clara found him standing in the barn long after sundown, lantern light flickering against the beams. He held a carving knife in one hand and a hunk of soft pine in the other. "Wasn't sleeping," he said when she entered. "I know," she replied. She stepped closer, watching the curls of wood fall in quiet spirals. The shape was crude but familiar, rounded cheeks, a thick body, a braid trailing down the back. He wasn't carving a bird this time. She reached out and touched the edge gently. "It's me," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. At dawn, the first shot rang out. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far. Jonas was already at the window when Clara bolted upright. He didn't speak, just pointed. In the distance, smoke rose. Not thick, not urgent, but deliberate. "They're burning the field line," he muttered. "Why?" "To scare us, push us toward town, or make us run." "Then what do we do?" Jonas turned to her slowly. "We stand." The sheriff came that afternoon. He rode up alone. No badge this time, no rifle, just a worn coat and a tired face. Jonas met him in the yard. "Don't want trouble," the sheriff said. "Then leave." The sheriff sighed. "Judges put a warrant out, claims she's stolen property, that she was promised to another, says you're harboring her unlawfully." "She ain't stolen." "I know." "Then tear up the warrant." "I can't." "Why?" The sheriff looked away. "Because the judge owns half this town, and I got a daughter of my own. You think I want to enforce this? I don't, but I can't save you, not this time." Jonas stepped forward. "You don't have to save me, just not shoot me." The sheriff met his gaze. Then he nodded once and rode away. That night Clara didn't sleep. She sat with Caroline and Miriam, brushing their hair in long, slow strokes. "Are we going to be all right?" Miriam asked, her voice too small for such a heavy question. Clara nodded, even though her throat hurt. "We're together," she whispered. "That's what matters." Jonas watched them from the doorway, his heart tight. He didn't know what was coming next. But he knew how it would end. Not with surrender, not with shame, but with fire. The kind that comes from a soul reborn. And Jonas was ready to burn for it. The next morning came not with birdsong or sunrise, but with hooves, dull, thudding hooves, 20 strong, maybe more, the kind that didn't gallop, the kind that surrounded, that circled like wolves and waited for a door to creak or a man to blink. Jonas was already on the porch, rifle balanced across his knee, when the first rider came into view. A long black coat flapped behind him, the same smug tilt to his hat. And behind him, lined up like an auction parade, were men with loaded rifles and quiet eyes. The judge didn't ride with them. He stayed behind, as men like him often did, pulling the strings and pretending their hands were clean. But his orders were clear enough. Clara was to be retrieved, the law was to be enforced, and Jonas Vance was to be made an example of. Jonas didn't stand, didn't lift the rifle, just stared straight ahead. The man leading the riders, a wiry brute named Roscoe Bent, who once beat a farmer near to death over a boundary dispute, swung down from his saddle with a theatrical grunt and spat into the dust. "Jonas," he said, nodding once like they were neighbors discussing the weather. "Judge says you got something that ain't yours." Jonas's voice was even low. "She's not something, and she's not his." Roscoe tilted his head, pretending to consider it. "Well, now, I suppose we could argue that all day, but it won't change much. Town's decided." "Town's wrong." A second rider laughed, a short, thick-necked man with a scar running from temple to jaw. "Then fix it in court, Vance." "You mean the court that ties girls to wagon wheels and calls it justice?" Roscoe's smile flattened. "You gonna make this hard, aren't you?" Jonas still hadn't moved, not an inch. "You came with 20 men for one woman and a man with 3 children. That's what makes it hard." Behind the door, Clara had gathered the children in the pantry, not out of fear but preparation. They were quiet. Miriam clutched her rag doll like it was holy. Caroline pressed her ear to the floorboards, listening to boots outside, and Matthew, the youngest, sat cross-legged, staring at the pantry wall with wide, wet eyes. Clara kept her hand on his back, steady and calm. Outside, Roscoe stepped up one more stair. "You've got till noon," he said, jerking his thumb back toward the horses. "Bring her out. Nobody gets hurt, and I walk away with your name still worth a 10 penny. Jonas didn't blink. "She's not leaving." Roscoe snorted. "Noon, Vance, and then we come through that door." He turned and walked off, spitting again before he mounted. The horses shifted. The rifles gleamed. The dust settled like judgment. And the waiting began. Inside, Jonas bolted every window, double-checked the cellar, poured water into basins, filled jars, lit every lantern. He moved like a man who'd lived through fire before and didn't plan to die in it. Clara followed him room to room, not asking questions, just moving as needed. She stoked the hearth, tied cloth around the children's ankles so they wouldn't slip. She pulled the hidden rifle from the rafters and checked the barrel with hands steadier than she thought she owned. "I can shoot," she said when Jonas paused. "I know." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in hours. "You don't have to. No one's asking you to." "You didn't ask me to stay either," she replied softly, "but I did." Jonas swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Together they finished preparing. Noon came like a thunderclap. Not loud, not violent, just sudden. One moment the sun sat high, the next shadows lengthened. Then came the knock. 3 raps. Polite. Mocking. Jonas didn't move. A pause. Then a 4th knock. Followed by the voice. "Last chance, Vance." Jonas stepped to the door slowly. "Then take it and leave," he said loud enough to carry. Silence. For a moment. Then chaos. The door burst inward on the fifth blow. Roscoe kicked it in with a roar, stepping through with his shotgun raised, only to meet Jonas's fist full in the face. The rifle Jonas had set across his knees hours ago cracked Roscoe's jaw and sent him spinning into the wall, dazed. The second man caught a shot to the shoulder, Clara, from behind the kitchen table. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her grip didn't shake. She ducked and reloaded with clean efficiency. Jonas grabbed the shotgun and fired into the entryway. Another man yelped and stumbled back, dragging another with him. The third tripped over Roscoe's body and fell into a table, smashing it to pieces. The house was smoke and splinters and screaming. Outside, the rest rushed forward. From the cellar came the howling cry of a frightened dog, Jonas's old mutt, tied in case they tried to sneak around. It barked like a beast possessed. Men circled the house. Shots hit the side planks. Windows cracked, but Clara and Jonas held the front. Upstairs, Miriam held her siblings close, whispering a prayer she only half remembered from childhood. Outside, a bottle was lit, a match struck. Then flame. The fire caught the porch first, dry wood, tinder-dry from summer. It leapt with greed, licking up beams and railing like a hungry snake. Jonas saw it through the broken door. "They're trying to smoke us out," Clara yelled. "We're not leaving," Jonas barked back. But he saw it too, the way the fire crept, the way the wind turned. This wasn't a siege anymore, it was a funeral pyre. And they were inside. Jonas ran to the back, kicked through the door to the washroom and ripped open the cellar door. Smoke poured through the house now, thick and choking. "Clara," he shouted, "get the children now." Clara didn't argue, she ran. In minutes the children were in his arms, coughing and weeping. They dropped into the cellar one by one, Clara last. Jonas grabbed the rifle, the lantern, and slammed the trap shut behind him. The world above roared. The cellar was dark, cold, silent. They listened as the roof collapsed, as beams cracked and glass shattered, as the riders outside whooped and cheered, thinking the fire had done what their bullets couldn't. But inside that cellar, hope breathed slow. It took till dawn for the fire to burn down. The house was gone, a black skeleton. But beneath the floor, in the hollow dug by Jonas's grandfather, 5 hearts beat. And when the riders left, thinking they'd won, Jonas Vance crawled from the ash with his family behind him, alive, coughing, covered in soot, but alive. He turned to the smoking ruins, eyes burning. "They think it's over," he said hoarsely. Clara stepped beside him. "But we're just beginning." They stayed in the woods that night, cloaked in pine and silence. Smoke from the still smoldering ruin drifted low through the trees like a funeral procession without a body. Jonas hadn't spoken much since they crawled out of the cellar. He'd used every last ounce of muscle and will just to pry open the heavy trapdoor and push the children through one at a time while the air above seethed with ash. His hands were raw, the burns on his neck shallow but tender, and yet none of that mattered. They were alive. Clara counted their heads more than once just to be sure. She wrapped the children tight in salvaged quilts, laid them down between tree roots and sat beside them through the long, bitter hours listening, always listening, for hoofbeats, for laughter, for the sound of 20 men discovering they hadn't killed what they came to kill. But nothing came, no pursuit, no call, just the wind and the ache of the land trying to bury its shame again. Jonas sat a few yards off, rifle across his knees, his back pressed against a tree. The fire had taken nearly everything. His food stores, the beds, the gifts the children had made for him last Christmas, the only photograph he had of Mary, his late wife, and most of the tools he'd built his life with. Gone. But the ones he loved were not. And that, for the moment, was enough. Morning found them curled close. Caroline's head tucked into Clara's lap. Matthew asleep with his face buried in Jonas's side. Miriam stretched between them like a bridge between 2 broken shores that had learned to mend together. Jonas didn't speak until the sun had fully risen. "We head west," he said flatly. "There's a friend near Tallow Ridge. Got a cabin he don't use much." Clara nodded. She didn't ask why Tallow Ridge. She didn't ask if the friend was real. She just helped lift the children to their feet and started walking beside him, leaving behind the scorched earth and the shallow pit that had once been home. The first day was quiet, but it didn't stay that way. By the third day on foot, Jonas knew they were being followed. Not close, not fast, but followed. A broken twig here, a faint glint of sunlight off something too smooth to be stone. Once he caught the sour scent of horses on wind that carried nothing else. He didn't tell Clara, didn't want the children frightened. But that night when they stopped near a frozen creek, he pulled her aside. "We're not alone," he said low. "They're testing us, seeing if we'll lead them somewhere." Her face went pale but not afraid. She just nodded and began wetting cloth to scrub soot from the children's cheeks. It wasn't the fear of dying that clenched her stomach. It was the thought of the children being taken, separated, sold, branded by men like Roscoe who laughed at girlhood as if it were something that could be broken and bought. She couldn't let that happen. "Then let's not lead them anywhere," she said. Jonas frowned. "What are you thinking?" She looked up at the stars through the pine canopy, and for a long moment didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was steel wrapped in calm. "Let's stop running." They doubled back. Not far, not foolishly. But enough. Jonas made it look like they'd continued west. Clever boot prints, snapped twigs, broken trail. Then they circled around, climbed high into the ridge above the valley they just passed. And they waited. From the cover of thick rock and brush, they watched the riders come. 3 of them this time, scouts, not the whole pack. Roscoe wasn't with them. That meant the judge was still pretending not to be involved, keeping his boots clean while his men hunted in the dirt. The scouts followed the false trail into the valley below, muttering as they went. Jonas took a deep breath and lowered the rifle. "I could take one," he whispered. Clara shook her head. "Let them go." Jonas hesitated. "If they report back, they'll say we're headed west. Let them think it." They waited until the riders vanished. Then they moved again, this time north. Harder terrain, longer path, but safer. They traveled only at night, slept in hollows by day. The children didn't complain, not once. Miriam kept the others close. Caroline walked until her legs gave out, then crawled. Matthew started calling Clara Ma without even realizing he'd done it. And still they moved. It was on the 6th night, nearly frozen, fingers numb, boots ruined from river crossings, that they saw it, lantern light, small, swinging. A cabin half buried in snow. Jonas stiffened. It wasn't the one they were headed for. This one wasn't supposed to be here. But Clara stepped forward first. "We don't have a choice." They approached slow, careful. Jonas's rifle was ready, but the door opened before they reached it. And the man inside, bearded, bent, with cataract-frosted eyes, didn't raise a weapon. He just stepped aside. "Get in," he rasped. "You'll catch death out there." The old man's name was Vernon. He'd been a trapper once, then a father, then a widower. Now he was just alone. Said he didn't mind the company, so long as they didn't steal his last 2 teeth or his jerky. He had a stove, some dried beans, and a heart that wasn't quite ready to die without hearing a child laugh again. They stayed 3 nights. The first night, no one slept. The second, Matthew curled up on Vernon's lap and started asking him about wolves. The third, Vernon handed Jonas a map drawn in pencil on the back of old envelope paper. "Cabin here," he pointed. "Old friend left it to me. Haven't been in years, might still be standing." Jonas took the map. Clara packed their things. They left at dawn, but not before Vernon pressed a book into Jonas's hand. A tattered Bible missing most of Genesis and all of Revelation. "Keep it close," Vernon said. "Even half a word from him is better than none." Jonas nodded, eyes damp. "He didn't say thank you." "He couldn't." They reached the cabin 2 nights later. It wasn't much, roof sagging, door half rotted, but it stood. And inside was a stove, a bed, and 4 walls. Home. For now. The children took to it like roots to soil. Clara wept when she found a drawer of old quilts untouched by mice. Jonas built a new table from scrap. And by the end of that week, the cabin smelled like stew and pine again. But they knew peace wouldn't last. Back in town, Roscoe had returned empty-handed. The judge was furious. Embarrassed. He doubled the bounty. $5 for the woman. 10 for the man. 2 for each child, if returned unharmed. No questions asked. Posters went up. A preacher from a nearby town wrote a sermon about the sin of vengeance and the strength of mercy. The judge tore it down. He wanted Jonas Vance hanged. But he didn't know that, while he was printing posters and hiring bounty men, Jonas and Clara were building something again. Not just a roof. Not just a hiding place. A family. One carved out of fire and failure, stubbornness and grace. It was on a Thursday when Jonas saw the rider. Alone. Moving slow. No weapon drawn. Not one of Roscoe's. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle lowered just in case. The rider stopped 10 paces from the steps and raised a hand. "Name S. Howard," he said. "I was married once to your cousin Me." Jonas squinted. "Me died 6 years back." Howard nodded. "I know. She told me before she passed, if ever I needed to find someone worth trusting, find Jonas Vance." Jonas didn't speak. "I heard what happened," Howard continued. "Back in town, thought you might want to know. The judge ain't done. He's sending men up the ridge, maybe 2 days behind me." Jonas' breath slow. "Why warn me?" Howard looked past him to the doorway where Clara stood, a child on each side. "Because I got a daughter," he said quietly. "And if it were her tied to that wheel, I'd want someone to burn down the world before they brought her back." Jonas nodded once. Then he looked at Clara. Then the sky. He built a home once. Lost it. Built another. Now he had to decide if he'd bury his family in the mountains or go down to town and end it once and for all. And this time, he wouldn't wait for the door to break. Jonas didn't sleep that night. He sat on the floor beside the hearth with the fire burning low, hands folded around the butt of his rifle, staring into the embers like they might burn a path clear through the choices before him. Clara sat across from him, arms wrapped around Matthew, who had fallen asleep in her lap, his little hand still curled around the hem of her skirt. Miriam and Caroline were nestled in the quilts just behind her, both still twitching in uneasy dreams. The wind outside had picked up, not storming, not yet, but enough to rattle the roof and whisper across the shutters like it was asking for permission to come inside. Clara didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was soft, calm, the same voice she'd used to soothe the children when they cried through the night. "You're thinking of going back." Jonas nodded once. Clara watched him, her eyes catching faint flickers of orange from the fire. "You think killing him will end it?" "I think not killing him might cost us more." There was no accusation in her tone, just quiet heartbreak. Jonas had never told her the full of what the judge had done to him, only pieces. The whippings, the false debt, the threats that followed him for years, but she knew enough. She'd seen the look in his eye when he first said the judge's name. "You think it'll keep the children safe?" she asked. "I think they'll never stop running if I don't." She leaned forward, laying Matthew gently beside the others, then reached across the fire and touched his hand. Her skin was warm and calloused, her fingers rough from chopping wood and cleaning fish and sewing split seams in old coats. She was not a delicate woman, nor a fragile one, but in that moment her touch was gentler than snow falling through morning sun. "If you go," she said, "you don't come back in pieces." Jonas looked at her for the first time since Howard's warning. He saw the fear in her, not for herself, but for him. For the man who'd taken in 3 children he didn't father, who'd protected them, fed them, held them when they were too frightened to sleep. For the man who gave her back the feeling of home when she'd buried it in grief long ago. Clara hadn't spoken the word love since she met him, but it clung to her now, invisible and undeniable, laced into every breath. He stood slowly and pulled her into his arms. She didn't cry. Neither did he. They just held one another there on the floor of that borrowed cabin while the fire hissed low and the world outside started closing in. He left at dawn. No saddle, no trail, just a rope and a rifle and an old mule named Baxter that Vernon had traded him long ago for a busted shovel and half a sack of oats. Clara watched from the porch until he disappeared over the ridge. She didn't call out. Didn't wave. Just turned and went inside. The children were still asleep. She had to keep them that way. Jonas made it to the edge of town just before dusk. He didn't enter through the road like a fool. He came down from the rise behind the livery, past the forgotten root cellar and the shack where the old gravedigger once lived before vanishing one night with all the town's silver spoons. The judge's house stood like it always had, 3 stories tall with its crooked chimney and painted windows and false charm, a symbol of the law and something darker hiding underneath it. Jonas tied Baxter behind a shed and crept forward. Every step was calculated, every sound measured. He didn't come to knock. He came to bury. But fate, cruel and fickle, had other plans. He hadn't made it halfway to the back porch when the barrel met his spine. "Drop it." "Roscoe." Jonas stiffened. Roscoe leaned in, breath sour, voice smug. "Took you long enough. Judge figured you'd come back once you grew a pair." Jonas let the rifle slip from his fingers. It hit the ground with a soft thud. "Turn," Roscoe said. He did. There were 4 others behind Roscoe, hired hands, young, hungry, paid by blood and coin. "You came alone," Roscoe laughed. "Mighty brave of you, mighty dumb too." Jonas didn't answer. He just stared past them to the house, to the second window where he knew the judge sat most evenings, drinking sour brandy and writing sermons he never preached. Then came the voice. "Well, well." The door opened. The judge stepped out like a man descending from a throne. Clean boots, trimmed beard, not a speck of dust on him. He smiled like a preacher at a funeral he didn't have to pay for. "I knew the Lord would bring you back, Jonas," he said, "and I'm glad he did, because now we can end this righteous and proper." Jonas didn't flinch. "You always were a coward behind velvet." The judge chuckled. "You wound me, son, after all I did for your kin. You buried my kin. And yet here you are, alive and breathing, dragging around another man's family like you can change your sins by raising orphans and a widow's grief." Jonas stepped forward. Roscoe pressed the barrel harder. But the judge raised a hand. "Let him." The gun lowered. Jonas took one more step. "You don't get to pretend God's on your side," Jonas said. "Not after what you did, not after what you let them do to her." The judge's smile faded. There it was, the truth between them. Clara hadn't said it out loud, but Jonas knew. The way she flinched at certain smells, the way she couldn't stand men in uniforms, the way she'd held that knife when she first met him, like she'd used it before and might again if it meant surviving. The judge's voice dropped. "Careful what you accuse." Jonas spit at his feet. "I ain't accusing, I'm condemning." The next moment happened fast. Roscoe raised the gun again, but Jonas was quicker. He ducked, rolled, grabbed his rifle from the dirt. Fired. Roscoe dropped like a stone. Chaos. 2 hired guns drew, but Jonas was already behind the well, firing again. 1 screamed. The judge ducked behind a post. Jonas kicked in the door. More men inside, but he wasn't staying. He ran through the house, tore up the stairs, grabbed a satchel from the hallway desk, the one labeled C, and jumped through the 2nd-story window as bullets tore the wallpaper behind him. He landed hard. Shoulder dislocated. But he had what he came for. He vanished into the alley before the judge could reload. And by the time the town had gathered, there was no sign of him. Just 2 dead men. 1 judge screaming for justice. And an empty satchel with 5 forged letters, enough to ruin half the territory if they got out. Jonas didn't stop until morning. He barely remembered the ride. His shoulder burned. His vision blurred. But the satchel was safe. Inside were documents, ledgers, contracts, blackmail, proof of every deed the judge ever paid to keep quiet. It was enough to buy safety. Or to buy the judge's silence. Either way, Jonas didn't come back with a corpse. He came back with power. He rode to the cabin by noon. Clara met him at the trailhead. He slid off Baxter and fell into her arms. "You're home," she whispered. He nodded, too tired to speak. She helped him inside. The children woke with cries of joy. Jonas wept. First time in 20 years. They didn't need to run anymore. He'd bought their future with blood and truth. And now it was time to build again. The winter passed slow but steady. Snow came again, light this time, not like the storms that once clawed through their roof and rattled their bones. The cabin held strong. The wood Jonas split burned clean and hot, and the new roof Vernon and Clara fixed together with pine tar and elbow grease didn't leak once. It was a season of waiting, of mending, and most of all of quiet. Jonas stayed close. No more trips to town, not yet. They didn't need supplies bad enough to risk what they'd built. Clara watched the ridge every morning all the same, expecting black horses or hired guns to come creeping down like a shadow returned. But the weeks passed and the woods stayed silent. Word must have traveled, about the gunfight, about what Jonas took, about the judge's iron teeth cracking under the weight of his own secrets. The world had shifted just enough. It had to. Vernon came by again come early March, hauling flour and salted pork from the next county over. He said nothing about the wanted posters that had vanished, about the hush money that likely changed hands in dusty backrooms behind saloons and law offices. But he patted Jonas's shoulder like a man proud of something bigger than survival. "Did what you had to," he muttered. Jonas only nodded. He didn't need a sermon, just space to breathe. The children changed too. Caroline stopped flinching when a bird startled outside. Matthew spoke more slow, thoughtful but certain. Miriam sang in the mornings, sometimes nonsense, sometimes hymns, always soft like a secret she trusted the walls to keep. Clara never let them forget where they'd come from, but she also refused to let their pain write the end of the story. Every meal shared, every game played near the fire, every time she handed a spoon to Matthew and waited patiently while he fed himself, even if half the stew ended up on his shirt, that was reclamation. That was healing, stubborn and sacred and slow. And Jonas, he learned to sit still. Not forever, not without twitching, but some nights long after the children had gone to sleep and Clara's hand found his beneath the table, he'd close his eyes and feel something like peace settle into his chest. Not loud, not perfect, but enough. Spring came like a whisper, not a shout. The creek unfroze. Birds returned. The cabin aired out with fresh pine wind, and the faint hum of bees returning to their work. Jonas walked the edge of the woods every morning now with Matthew balanced on his shoulders and the other two trailing close behind. He showed them tracks in the mud, how to spot a deer by the bend of broken branches, how to tell time by the sun and hunger by the call of birds. They listened, not always perfectly, but earnestly. One morning near the ridge, Matthew asked him a question. "Are you our daddy now?" Jonas stopped cold, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He crouched, lifting the boy down gently, kneeling so their eyes met square. "I'm here," he said, "and I ain't leaving, that's what matters." Matthew didn't ask again, just took his hand. Sometimes truth didn't need labels. On the first Sunday after the frost melted, Clara asked for a ride to town. Jonas hesitated, but she held his gaze with something stronger than insistence. He saw no fear in her eyes, only resolve. So they went. The wagon creaked under their weight, but the trail was easier now with the snow gone. The sky had softened, the air warmer, filled with the scent of thawing earth and greening grass. They passed through Hollow Bend before noon. Heads turned. People stared. A few of the same men who once laughed when she was tied to a wagon wheel now tipped their hats or looked away quick. Jonas didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The town remembered, and in some deep unspoken way, it knew better than to mock what it couldn't break. The general store was quiet. They picked up flour, oats, a tin of oil, and a sack of sugar Clara had long denied herself. On the way out, she paused by the dressmaker's window. Inside, behind the glass, was a plain white dress, simple, stitched from cotton, but elegant in its quiet way. She said nothing, just looked. And Jonas, without a word, turned and walked inside. They left with the dress folded neat in brown paper. And that evening, as the sun slipped low behind the trees, Jonas built a fire in the field behind the cabin, while the children gathered flowers and Clara set her hair with gentle fingers. It wasn't a wedding like townsfolk threw. No pastor, no ring of pews, no violin or dance floor. Just two people, 3 children, a fire, and a promise whispered under stars older than grief itself. Jonas took her hand. Clara looked up at him. And when he said her name, just her name, soft like a hymn, not needing anything else, the past broke apart like glass in a river. And she smiled, because in that moment she knew. She wasn't the joke anymore. She was the ending. And it was hers. Years passed. The judge died alone in a chair with a pistol by his bed and no friends left to lie at his funeral. The papers said it was a stroke. Vernon said it was justice. Jonas said nothing. Some things didn't need retelling. Hollow Bend grew quieter. Children aged. The forest crept back into places it hadn't touched in decades. And the cabin stood. Always. On good days, Clara sang. On harder days, she stood alone near the place where she'd once been humiliated, her arms crossed, face steady. But never again ashamed. Matthew learned to carve. Caroline took to mending. Miriam baked better than Clara by 9. And Jonas, he learned to laugh. Not often. Not loud. But true. Sometimes when strangers passed by and asked how he ended up there, he'd smile faintly and say, "They tied her to a wheel thinking she was nothing." Then he'd nod toward the porch where Clara sat, rocking gently, eyes on the field, kids running wild before supper. And I proved him wrong. Spring turned to summer the way a wound turns to a scar, quiet, slow, but sure. It wasn't loud like winter's breaking, and it didn't need to be. The trees leafed heavy, the creek deepened, and the wind lost its bite. The cabin no longer felt like shelter, it felt like home. Jonas came in one evening with dirt on his hands and sweat along his collar, brushing past the children as they played barefoot in the mud, hollering and laughing like the world had never once tried to take anything from them. Clara stood by the stove, stirring corn mush and humming. He watched her a long moment before he spoke. "I want to build a second room," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For us," he replied simply. "A door that closes, a space that's ours." Clara's lips parted slightly, not in surprise but in something deeper, a soft breaking. Not many men would build more when they already had enough. Fewer still would call space between four walls a kind of love. But Jonas never said what didn't need saying. He just did. So they spent the next week sawing beams and setting planks. Jonas worked slow and sure, and when he faltered, Caroline held nails while Matthew learned to hammer them in without splitting the wood. Miriam painted the new door, a faded blue she mixed from berries and hope. By midsummer the room was done. A modest bed, a shelf for folded linens, a single oil lamp Clara had saved from her father's things. No ribbon, no grandeur, just peace. That night, after the children were tucked beneath quilts and the frogs began their song from the creek, Clara stepped through that door barefoot, hair loose and heart steady. Jonas was waiting, candle-lit, boots off, face turned toward the moonlight. He didn't reach for her, didn't need to. She came to him, laid her hand over his, and whispered, "You built more than a room." He looked at her, not just the curve of her face, or the soft shadows at her jaw, but all of her. "You did the rest," he said. Outside, the wind rustled the trees with the gentleness of a lullaby. Inside, two people lay close, not afraid, not uncertain, just together. No ghosts. No gallows. Just life. And that was enough.